Good. Well, good morning all, and or good afternoon or good evening, and welcome to our final simultaneous session. Today, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sarah Kohles, who has been teaching as a professor of biblical studies at Loras College and also at Wartburg Theological Seminary in Dubuque, Iowa. Sarah's also been doing some teaching at St. Mary's University in San Antonio since she completed her PhD at the Graduate Theological Union in 2019. Also, during this past year, she has assisted the Shalom Spirituality Center, also in Dubuque, developing and transitioning to an online program, and she taught one of the major sessions in that is called Scripture in Times of Disruption, and she's already prepared another program for the fall, Migration in the Bible. Kohles also has co-edited and contributed to a collection of essays entitled In Our Own Words, Religious Life in a Changing World. She is currently preparing another collection of essays for publication entitled Creating Spaces for Women in the Catholic Church. Today, we are especially eager to hear her presentation, Michal, Reframed, a Feminist Approach to Reading the Woman at the Window Motif in 2 Samuel 6, 16 through 23. Sarah.
Thank you for the introduction, Jenna. It's good to be with you all. Women hover at the edges of men's stories throughout much of the Bible. Women are only 5.5 to 8% of all the characters in the Bible, according to the counting of Carla Baumbach in Names and Naming in the Biblical World, a delightful little introductory article in the dictionary Women in Scripture, edited by Carol Myers. As women constitute a mere single-digit percentage of the characters, the stories of women in the biblical text are often incomplete. Michal, for example, the daughter of Saul and wife of David, appears in Scripture as part of men's stories. Ilse Muellner, in her article on the books of Samuel in Feminist Biblical Interpretation, describes women's stories as being fragmented. Indeed, Michal is only mentioned within the context of the rivalry between her father Saul and her husband David. Whatever glimpse readers are given of her interests are placed at the service of men's narratives. It is left to interpreters to collect the fragments or the broken shards of Michal's stories that remain and piece them together in order to gain a greater sense of Michal's character. As J. Cheryl Exum notes in Feminist Criticism, whose interests are being served, a feminist interpretation of the biblical text acknowledges there are always power dynamics at work, in which women have historically been the consistent losers. The lack of women in the Bible demonstrates this patriarchal bias and the dire need for feminist criticism. Feminist interpretation attends to the disparities: who is mentioned, who is neglected, whose concerns are deemed noteworthy. How might interpreters piece together something meaningful of Michal from the fragments of her story? Yet, feminist interpretation is sometimes viewed as an ideological lens imposed upon a text. However, today I want to suggest that the Hebrew text of 2 Samuel 6, 16 through 23 invites, encourages, and even impels a Michal-centered reading that privileges her concerns and critiques. A close feminist reading of 2 Samuel 6, 16 to 23 demonstrates that the Hebrew invites readers to pause and consider the narrative from Michal's perspective, and even hints that Michal's view of David might align with Yahweh's perspective. Before I turn to the text, allow me to say a few words about the woman at the window motif in the ancient Near East. Ancient Near Eastern ivory artifacts of the woman at the window from the 8th century BCE depicting a woman's head triply framed here have been found in Nimrud, Arslantash, Korsbad, and Samaria. These figures are thought to be goddesses or queens. According to Eleanor Ferris Beach in Transforming Goddess Iconography in the Hebrew Narrative, these ivory artifacts are consistently found as part of ceremonial furniture located in the rooms and hallways adjacent to royal courtyards. In fact, the woman at the window artifacts are present along with other symbols associated with infants and new life, as well as death and funerary scenes. They seem particularly related to succession, where births and deaths of royal figures are liminal moments that carry the potential for life or death, joy or sorrow. The window is a symbol of transition, possibility, and vulnerability. Another one of them. The woman at the window does not only appear as a motif in material culture across the ancient Near East, it also appears as a literary motif within the biblical text. In addition to Michal, Sisera's mother in Judges 5:28 through 30 waits at the window for her son, the Canaanite general, to return home, though the reader knows he has been killed in battle. Jezebel in 2 Kings 9:30 through 37 presents herself as the queen she is, appears as a woman at the window, and faces her death. Thus, these fenestrated women may be viewed as figures marking liminal space in which the line of succession, their households, or even their own lives are at stake. Therefore, however fragmented Michal's story might be, she remains featured and framed at the window as she observes David dancing below in verse 16. The woman at the window motif focalizes Michal's perspective and adds the intensity and vulnerability of liminal space to the scene. The narrative of Saul and David attempting to outmaneuver one another pauses to frame Michal in the window scene. This framing of Michal in conjunction with a close feminist reading of 2 Samuel 6:16 through 23 invites readers to consider Michal's point of view. Michal's position at the window utilizes space to highlight her point of view. There are two scenes in 2 Samuel 6:16 through 23 governed by both space and point of view. The first scene describes the celebratory and cultic depiction of the entrance of the ark into the city from Michal's point of view at the window in verses 16 through 19. Michal is separated from the scene. Therefore, there is distance between Michal and David. In The Watcher at the Window, Don Seaman identifies the window as a permeable boundary, but a boundary nonetheless that widens the distance between Michal and David. There's also a distinct separation between Michal and all the people of verse 19, who receive David's blessing as he distributes the food to all the people and to all the crowd. Michal alone is distanced from them all. Perhaps there was a time when Michal was included among the crowds, such as when the women sang of Saul and David in 1 Samuel 18:7. Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands. If Michal was included in the people's praises of David then, which is possible since we are told she loved David, according to 1 Samuel 18 verses 20 and 28, she is no longer included among those praising David here. Instead, she despises him from the window. And so she provides a unique vantage point. According to Shimon Bar Ephrat in Narrative Art in the Bible, space in the Hebrew scriptures is often undefined. Places are not described in great detail and typically serve as the backdrop for the events that are unfolding. Also, space is often considered to be of secondary importance compared to time and plot, which move the action forward. However, space in 2 Samuel 6:16 through 23 is essential for interpreting the narrative. The reason for Michal's separation from the activity down below is unknown. The reader is positioned and therefore encouraged to view the proceedings of Michal from her point of view through the nifal verb nishkafa, or she looked down upon. In his commentary on 2 Samuel, Craig Morrison writes that, quote, the narrator swings toward the window, end quote, incorrectly suggesting that the reader is positioned on the ground with David, the ark, and the crowd, looking up to see a scowling Michal. However, the nifal form of the verb nishkafa aligns the reader with Michal, inviting the reader to read from her perspective from the height of the window. Therefore, the text positions the reader in the exact opposite position from what Morrison suggests by describing Michal as looking down through the window and then depicting the scene. Therefore, the reader views the celebration from Michal's perspective. It is a very different vantage point to experience the celebration from above rather than the midst of the crowd of revelers. A person has a wider view and can see more, presumably with fewer obstacles, with the advantage of height and distance. Thus, the choice of the nifal verb invites the reader to consider Michal's perspective. The reader subtly is invited to break from David's perspective and to choose a different side in this instance, to see, to witness, and to understand the unfolding events through the eyes of Michal. The use of the hifil form of the verb could have positioned the reader with David rather than Michal. Then the readers would have been below with the dancing David looking up at a disdainful Michal. Yet it is the nifal form used here. In such a David-centric text, it is significant that the readers are positioned to share Michal's perspective from the window instead of David's point of view. Therefore, readers are specifically invited to witness and view David's ecstatic dancing and playing before the ark, leading the cultic rites of offering offerings and distributing these offerings through Michal's eyes in verses 16 through 19. The view from the window sharpens into a point of view. Then the reader is not to assume that the narrator's choice to give David the last word in verses 21 and 22 and the statement of Michal's childlessness in verse 23 are reasons to dismiss her. Instead, the use of space and point of view demand that Michal's perspective be considered, which means the reader must grapple with why she despises David in her heart. Readers are encouraged to occupy the same space as Michal and distance themselves from an immediate identification with David. The story is an invitation to stand beside Michal or even borrow her eyes in order to see what she sees, to attempt to understand the cause of her strong and negative feelings toward David, and to wonder if taking on her point of view might lead to discovering that her feelings are justified. The window frame becomes a space that highlights Michal, provides her with a different perspective, and even encourages readers to adopt that perspective. The first scene, viewed from Michal's window above, shifts then to a close-up perspective. The distance from the window concludes after David blesses the people and the people go each to his house. The following verse then facilitates the transition between the scenes with the repetitions of the words to his house, though this time it's David returning to his house. So first in verse 19, the people to his house, and then David to his house here in verse 20. This allows for the two scenes to be interpreted through Michal's eyes and continue viewing the unfolding events through Michal's perspective. Then David goes to his own house in order to bless it and encounters Michal in verse 20. The reader stood with Michal in the previous scene, sharing her view of David's actions. As the distant view of David becomes a close-up perspective, the scene might be said to shift in order to highlight the interactions between Michal and David. The previous distance and wide perspective from the window is now lacking. Now the reader views the interactions between Michal and David in their life at home, though still also through the window of Michal's eyes. Michal's intense dislike of David continues to invite the reader to proceed to this view and this scene from her perspective. So what does Michal see? Michal is a rare character who's positioned in such a way as to see David through different vantage points, both distance and up close, giving her a perspective that others do not have. The act of looking through a window suggests not only a distant view, but a clear perspective. In Genesis 26:8, Abimelech looks down through a window and discovers the true nature of Isaac and Rebekah's relationship. They are not brother and sister, but husband and wife. It is the window vantage point that allows Abimelech to gain understanding and see through the deception perpetuated by those he views. Therefore, Michal's window view of David might allow her to see him clearly as well. Michal's unique perspective may provide her with an understanding and insight as she witnesses David's behavior. From her window perch, Michal sees David dancing and playing before the ark and the people. He offers sacrifice and distributes food to everyone present in verses 17 through 19. These actions in and of themselves do not seem obviously objectionable. Celebration and cultic offerings in the presence of the ark seem like appropriate actions, and a king and leader over the people seems like an appropriate figure to lead the festivities. Reviewing Michal's context is necessary to move to the final scene and hear Michal's words in order to have a better understanding of her distaste for what she sees. Michal's understanding of what she actually sees out the window is informed by a long view of the narrative, which includes situating the immediate events she witnesses from the window in the context of the events that led up to it. These events include David's actions prior to bringing the ark to Jerusalem, as well as her understanding of David based on her previous interactions with him. Prior to bringing the ark into Jerusalem, David has engaged in ongoing maneuvering with both Saul and the Philistines in 1 Samuel chapters 27 through 29, which ultimately resulted in the death of Saul and others in Saul's house in battle against the Philistines in 1 Samuel 31 verses 1 through 10. More immediately to this window scene, David solidifies his power over Israel and Judah in 2 Samuel 5, 1 through 5, defeats the Philistines in 2 Samuel 5, 19 through 25, and the Jebusites in 5, 7, before creating his own capital city of David in Jerusalem in 5, 9. David's attempts to bring the powerful Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem are thwarted by the death of Uzzah in 2 Samuel 6, 7. David is angered by the disruption of his plans and quite possibly afraid of divine power he cannot control. So he decides to send the ark to the house of Obed-Edom instead, just to be safe. In 2 Samuel 6, 8 through 10. Obed-Edom's house prospers due to the presence of the ark in verse 11, which leads David to determine that such prosperity needs to come to him instead in verse 12. After all this political maneuvering, David dances, sacrifices, plays, and offers his offerings as he brings the ark into Jerusalem in verses 13 through 19. Numerous scholars highlight and affirm David's machinations. For example, Anthony Campbell, in his commentary on 2 Samuel, calls David a, quote, genius, end quote, for putting the centers of politics and religion in the same city by bringing the ark to Jerusalem. Tony Cartledge, in his commentary on 1 and 2 Samuel, claims that the Deuteronomistic writer believes David can be both sincere and strategic. C.L. Sao, in Myth, Drama, and the Politics of David's Dance, focuses on the ark narrative and sees this passage as, quote, the divine warriors rise to supremacy, end quote. Similarly, P. Kyle McCarter Jr. refers to David's preparedness in welcoming the ark as, quote, political sagacity, end quote. Cartledge contrasts David's brilliance and daring with Saul as he notes that Saul, quote, never dared approach the ark, end quote. However, it is not likely that Michal shares these interpreters' admiration for David's political acumen, as it has at times been exercised at her expense. Approbation for David's consolidation of political power neglects to weigh the cost of such power. Adopting Michal's vantage point encourages readers and interpreters to consider David's methods for achieving power and the people who experience it. And Michal's experiences are particularly enlightening. In previous stories about Michal, the reader learns that at one time she loved David in 1 Samuel 18, 20, and 28, and ultimately becomes David's wife in 1 Samuel 18, 27, after an extended power play between her father Saul and her husband David in 1 Samuel 18, 13 through 30. Saul first offers his elder daughter Merab, but marries her to someone else instead. Saul then suggests that he will give Michal to David as his wife, but for the price of 100 Philistine foreskins. Saul intends that David will die in conflict with the Philistines in 1 Samuel 18:25, and then he will not have to deal with the political problem David presents. After David escapes Saul's murderous intention in 1 Samuel 19:18, Saul marries off Michal to someone else in 1 Samuel 25:44. After Saul and much of his house has died, David negotiates to have Michal sent back to him as his wife in 2 Samuel 3:13. Given how successful David has been at political maneuvering, it does seem that David's reason for desiring Michal as a wife is to strengthen his political situation. If he marries and maintains a wife from Saul's royal house, it further secures his own power and renders Saul's house less of a threat. It is also noteworthy that there is never any indication that David returns Michal's love. There are very few verses featuring Michal, and we have mentioned most of them already, with the exception of a list of Saul's offspring in 1 Samuel 14:49. They all have to do with the political jockeying for power between David and Saul. Even though Saul attempts to trap David in 1 Samuel 18:21, one might view Michal as trapped instead, caught between her father and her husband in this patriarchal power play. She is the object of negotiations, not one who determines her own fate. Interestingly enough, besides the 2 Samuel 6:16 through 23 pericope, our primary focus, there is another story of Michal and David inside their house that involves a window in 1 Samuel 19:11 through 18. Two stories of Michal with windows and David in the house seem rather intriguing. This first narrative of Michal in the window takes place after the reader learns that Michal loves David and is given as a wife to David. Robert Alter, in The Art of Biblical Narrative, notes that Michal demonstrates the narrator's claim that she loves David by her actions. She warns David that her father Saul will kill him and helps him escape through the window, makes it appear that David is in bed, and claims that David forced her to lie in order to escape in 1 Samuel 19:11 through 18. So here Michal loves David and saves his life by means of the window. David departs, which creates distance between herself and David, and this distance remains until David returns home after bringing the ark into Jerusalem. During this time, Michal moves from loving David to despising him, demonstrating a complete transformation of Michal's feelings toward David. The events that happen in the meantime include Saul's marrying Michal to someone else, and David's negotiating for the return of a woman the text never says he's loved in 1 Samuel 25:13. Meanwhile, David marries other women in 1 Samuel 25:39 through 43, and David Klein's in the story of Michal, wife of David, and its sequential unfolding, comments on David's absence, noting that he was nearby and always gets what he wants. This suggests that if David had wanted Michal with him, he would have returned for her. Thus, Michal is used for her connection to Saul's house and is easily discarded. These experiences will certainly impact what she sees when she looks upon her husband through the window. So, Michal has been at home sitting at the window when David starts toward home in verse 20. The scene is filled with irony, beginning with how the stage is set. According to McCarter, women waiting at the window for their husbands, lovers, and sons to return home, particularly after a battle, is part of the woman at the window literary motif. He references Judges 5:28 and Song of Songs 2:9. However, Michal is not waiting longingly for a husband or lover or son to return home. Instead of warmly welcoming David, this woman at the window is critical of David once he arrives home. Michal leaves her window perch in order to go out and meet David in verse 20. According to Nehemiah Ashkenazi's psychoanalytical interpretation in Women at the Window, Biblical Tales of Oppression and Escape, windows, along with doors, are openings in which men are permitted to pass through in order to enter. However, women are not allowed to cross those thresholds of windows or doorways to go outside. Drawing on examples from Dinah in Genesis 34:1 and 2, and the concubine of Judges 19, Ashkenazi discusses the outside as a dangerous place for women. Yet Michal risks danger, leaves the confines of her window, and passes through the doorway of the house in order to confront David. J. Cheryl Exum in Fragmented Women, Feminist Subversions of Biblical Narratives, finds that Michal's experiences, quote, literary murder, end quote, because of her choice to go out and meet David in defiant confrontation. Thus, Michal's transgression of the spatial boundaries allotted to her correspond with her critique of her husband. She is discredited and silenced for these transgressions. The narrator's David-centric telling adds an additional layer of irony. When David comes home intending to bless his own home as he blessed the people in verse 18, he receives antagonism from Michal in verse 20 here instead. How the king of Israel honored himself today, since he revealed himself today in the eyes of the maidservants of his servants as one of the vain ones, utterly reveals himself. Michal's words are dripping with sarcasm. She says that the king was honored, but she actually means the opposite. Michal also calls David one of the vain ones, which can have a semantic range of meaning that includes vain, empty, foolish, or unprincipled. So calling David one of the vain, empty, foolish, unprincipled ones after calling him distinguished clearly indicates that this is ironic or sarcastic speech. She does not believe David is distinguished. So what is Michal indicating? She uses variations of the word galah 3 times in order to describe David. The word galah can mean to uncover, expose, or reveal. All 3 instances are in the nifal, which allows for the reflexive interpretation of David revealed himself. The first instance of the verb galal is in the imperfect, and the second 2 instances are in the infinite construct and the infinite absolute, emphasizing the active revealing, which can be rendered utterly reveals himself. Thus, David utterly reveals himself. It is possible that Michal is concerned about David physically revealing himself when dancing before the ark. Nakedness, as we know, is considered shameful. Many commentators interpret Michal as scornful because of the lack of dignity of David's dancing in verse 16, and attempting to determine how it is that he may have been inappropriately clad. McCarter says the linen ephod David wears might be a child's garment and therefore leaving David, quote, scantily clad, end quote. Ganana Robertson in Let Us Be Like the Nations, a commentary on the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, wonders if David's frenzied dancing has caused the garment to slip from his body, thus exposing him. Cartledge concludes that the priestly garment David is wearing, the linen ephod, is a cloth that would have covered David's hips and thighs in a manner that is appropriate for temple work, but not sufficient for ecstatic dancing. I would suggest that focusing on how or why David might have been physically uncovered might not be asking the right question, or at least not the whole question. Instead, the physical uncovering of David might have another meaning altogether. Through his behavior, David has revealed his character to Michal. The sarcasm and irony in Michal's words require that the reader considers that there might be additional meaning beyond the surface meaning. James Scott in Domination and the Art of Resistance, Hidden Transcripts, notes that speech with double meanings is a way for people who do not have power to exert some level of power. It is a form of resistance and pushing back against unjust sources of power. Also, it is worth noting that Saul, Michal, and David are tricksters. Using clever or nuanced speech is one characteristic of a trickster. According to Barbara Babcock Abrahams in A Tolerated Margin of Mess, The Trickster and His Tales Reconsidered, just as Michal might be considered a liminal character as a woman at the window and a daughter, tricksters are also liminal figures who are found on the margins of society. Tricksters also resist or upend social order. They surprise and they are unpredictable. They can serve as a challenge to the current social situation. Melissa Jackson in Comedy and Feminist Interpretation of the Hebrew Bible adds that tales about tricksters are stories about characters who lack status and break the rules in order to survive. Such characters are expected to be clever and disobedient. According to Babcock Abrahams, they are also frequently the heroes within narratives. Their use of power is exercised subversively, often through mockery or speech. Finally, in A Prelude to Biblical Folklore, Underdogs and Tricksters, Susan Niditch focuses on tricksters and underdogs as heroes who are trying to improve their situation via their tricks. Trickster stories are stories about vulnerable people gaining ground through wisdom or cleverness. Rachel Adelman identifies Saul as a trickster and parallels his marriage maneuvering in regards to his giving David the second daughter instead of the first, to Laban, who tricks Jacob into marrying a different daughter than originally intended. Adelman further compares Michal's tricking her father by use of gods to Rachel's tricking her father while stealing the household gods. However, Saul, Michal, and David can all rightly be considered tricksters. As a trickster, Michal is a marginal character at the chaotic edge of men's stories. She acts heroically when she protects and saves her husband David from her father's murderous intentions. Michal creates an alternative route of escape through the window for David. She utilizes deceptive methods as she suggests David is ill and hides a household god in the bed to mimic his form. When faced with her father's murderous anger regarding her deception, she deflects his anger from herself as she claims David threatened her if she did not assist him in escaping. Michal's words and actions demonstrate her cleverness and the maneuvering that was necessary to ensure David's survival, as well as her own self-protection, all in 1 Samuel 19:11-17. She successfully managed to protect herself and someone else from danger. What if Michal then is held up, framed, and remembered as an example of a woman who manages to protect and to survive patriarchal power struggles? She is successful in her cleverness and then maybe a hero. However, Michal has still more in common with tricksters and with David. David is often depicted in a number of ways that describe his littleness or vulnerability. He is the youngest and seemingly least significant of the sons of Jesse in 1 Samuel 16:11. David is portrayed as a young man who defeats Goliath in 1 Samuel 17:33. Even in the stories pertinent to Michal, David expresses his unworthiness to become the king's son-in-law in 1 Samuel 18:18 and describes himself as lowly in 2 Samuel 6:21 and 22. While there are far few stories that mention Michal, she is also a younger daughter who supplants the potential position of her older sister in 1 Samuel 18:17-27. This is not unlike Jacob and Esau, where the younger is preferred over the elder. While David may be portrayed as lesser, he actually proves to be a master military mind who becomes king. Michal is all the more vulnerable as she's yanked around between her father and husband as a political pawn. Yet she carves out some agency for herself anyway. She takes initiative and rescues David. She also proves herself unbeholden to merely supporting the patriarchal figures in her life, as she sharply critiques David's behavior in verse 20. Despite being caught between her father and husband, Michal does manage to be subversive and to defy them both. In addition to the clever phraseology of a hero trickster, Michal's words may also be considered in a further positive light. Her words may also be considered an example of shaming speech. In honor and shame in gender-related legal situations in the Hebrew Bible, Victor Matthews explains that shame can function as a means of social control. It is the role of the entire household to ensure that the behavior of all members is appropriate. Any behavior that is dishonorable, deviant, or foolish is to be curtailed. Therefore, Michal's critique of David might also be viewed as an attempt to encourage him to amend his behavior. Matthews writes that quote, shaming speech calls on each person to behave honorably, with carefully thought out actions, not in the manner of fools who act in the height of passion without thinking, end quote. Although Matthews does not specifically cite David's behavior, his comments describe David's behavior well. Michal calls David the fool in verse 20, and his wild public dancing could be described as the height of passion. Reading Michal's words as an example of positive shaming for the purpose of changing David's behavior fits well here. First, Matthews notes that the shaming must somehow be public in order to be effective, and it is said that Michal went out to meet David. Thus, it is entirely possible that some of all of Israel witnessed their exchange. The presence of the audience or the public opinion to witness a confrontation could have acted as a check on inappropriate behavior. Second, David is elsewhere malleable and able to be convinced to behave in an appropriate manner as king in 2 Samuel 14. Finally, Matthews notes that shaming can also be used to transfer status. Michal's status has been reduced as a member of the dwindling house of Saul. David has won the power struggle with Saul's house. Michal's attempt at shaming might then be viewed as an attempt to restore some of her status as a member of Saul's house. However, Michal's critique of David is further justified since she is in fact not alone in her critique. Instead, Michal's critique is at the center of three critiques situated within relatively close proximity to one another. Both of the other critiques of David are made by the divine. 2 Samuel 6, 16 through 23 is in fact David's second attempt to bring the ark into Jerusalem. The first time the oxen shook the ark and it started to fall from the cart that carried it, and Uzzah was struck down for reaching out in an attempt to steady the ark in 2 Samuel 6, 6, and 7. That the death of Uzzah is the result of merely offering assistance might seem unfair to today's reader. However, cartilage suggests that the ark may have wanted to fall down off the hill in protest of David's actions. Thus, the ark is an entity that exercises agency. David's response is anger and fear because his plans have, at least temporarily, been thwarted, and the ark is a divine power he cannot control. A death as a result of the attempted transportation of the ark might be seen as a divine reprimand, for the ark's movement to the city of David further solidifies and centralizes David's power in Jerusalem. Dana Nolan Fowle in A Broken Hallelujah, remembering David's justice and the cost of the house, observes that both the ark and Michal resist David's attempts to contain them. Immediately following Michal's critique of David, Yahweh also offers another reprimand of David when he wants to build a house for the ark of Yahweh in 2 Samuel 7:2. Yahweh's response through the prophet Nathan is a rhetorical question. When have I asked anyone to build me a house? Thus, Yahweh denies David's construction endeavors. Is not building a house for Yahweh in the city of David another way to expand David's power? Yahweh prefers a tent to such a grandiose project. Given Michal's critique is situated between these two divine critiques of David, one might conclude that if anyone is aligned with the intention of divine power, it is actually Michal rather than David. Michal's vision challenges the assumption that David is favored in 2 Samuel 7:3. Her vision is actually closer to Yahweh's vision as the central of three critiques of David. It is especially ironic since David's words seem to claim that Yahweh is on his side as he flaunts his chosenness as a leader instead of Saul's house over and against Michal. Furthermore, it is possible to interpret Michal as aligned with divine intention elsewhere as well. It is frequently the female characters who deceive and protect in accord with divine will. Rebekah aids her son Jacob in deceiving Isaac and helping him receive the birthright intended for his brother in Genesis 27. It is Rebekah whose actions are portrayed as being aligned with divine intention as she acts to fulfill the words she heard regarding her pregnancy in Genesis 25:23. Similarly, Michal earlier rescues David and deceives her father, which protects David, who is frequently portrayed as Yahweh's chosen one. Michal first chooses David, then critiques him. Likewise, the narrator tells readers that Yahweh chooses David, but then Yahweh and the ark also reprimand him. It seems Michal may not be alone in her perspective after all. In conclusion, Michal is featured and framed as a woman at the window, her vulnerability focalized in liminal space. She is poised to observe the power dynamics of David, both at a distance and up close. The feminist practice of highlighting the perspective of women characters in scripture is aided by the Hebrew here. Michal's seemingly unique position, as indicated by the nifal form of the verb shakaf, she looks down, invites readers to adopt her perspective and see what she sees. Michal's view is shaped by her experience of being objectified and treated as a pawn by her father and David. Yet instead of being merely contained in her window, she steps out to confront the power-seeking David revealed to her. Her heroic bravery in the face of her marginalization and dismissal yields a voice of critique preserved alongside Yahweh's own critique of David's power-seeking behavior. Perhaps the greatest compliment we can pay Michal as readers and interpreters of her story is to pause, wonder about her perspective, join her at the window, and see what she sees. Thank you. I certainly invite questions.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a very challenging and a very comprehensive presentation, and invites us to think about women at the window as not a place of confinement, but also, as you so well presented, a place that features women. I might start with a question and wonder, are there other women that you imagine you could read who, you mentioned two women, you said Sisera's mother and also Jezebel. Do you see potential for also reading them in a similar way?
Yes. In the case of Sisera's mother in particular, Sisera's mother is also, the text itself uses the form of the nifal verb, which positions us similarly, where we are looking out the window through her eyes. Mm-hmm. And in that case, at the end of Judges 5, verses 28 through 30, really it sets us up for a bit of emotional whiplash, I think. We're convinced that we are supposed to identify then quickly with Sisera's mother, the mother waiting for the son we know who has died. And then we realize that she's imagining the rape of Israelite women as the reason for her son's delay. And so it's this sympathy and then disgust there, which I think moves us in another direction altogether. But
Mhm.
yes, in Jezebel's case, we are positioned from below. So we are observing Jezebel from below as she appears, because it is the hifil form of the verb that is used there.
I admire your knowing these verbs so well. So with the text in front of you, it looks like you have some people in the chat. So I'm going to let you go ahead and handle that.
Certainly. Lori, any thoughts on Tekla in the window, listening to Paul and the acts of Paul and Tekla? Does the motif transcend the Old Testament? Maybe. Lori, do you want to say more about that? I haven't looked at the text in particular to see. I haven't looked at the Greek of Tekla to see how that would go. I don't know if you have a follow-up, or if Lori wants to be in the window or not here in the window with us. It may transcend the Old Testament. Actually, Carla Gottlieb has a delightful book on the window in art, excuse me. And the first 2 chapters really deal with Egypt and the ancient Near East, but it traces the window imagery through much later. That could be a resource for that. I see Richard has a question or a comment. Yes.
What a fascinating paper about Michal. I've always, because we have a son that we named Micah, and if it would have been a girl, we'd have named her Michal. So it's always been important to me. But I wonder if at the end, when she remains childish, if that isn't some kind of a reversal, that God says, okay, you were justified in criticizing David, but there's a price to pay for, standing up and criticizing. And so she was childish. Could you comment on that?
Yes, a number of the commentators about Michal did view her childlessness as a punishment, either for critiquing David, but in that case, critiquing David was also aligned closely with critiquing his ecstatic worship and bringing the ark before the covenant. So a lot of commentators kind of bled into perceiving Michal's perspective and disdain as being anti-Yahweh and not just anti-David. There's actually a really not perfect divide, but quite the noticeable divide that a lot of the commentaries written by men slipped in far more critique for David in their, or critique for Michal in their commentary, while those written by women were far less so. They were far more supportive of Michal. Daniel Bodie stands out as a notable exception, as he talked about Michal. Actually, he gave her a greater deal of agency. He sees it as David coming to Michal and Michal's rejecting him as the reason for her childlessness. So, because David has a great deal from Bodie's perspective to gain from having a child with Michal and solidifying the dynasty and his power. So
I like that interpretation better, that David says, let's live together, husband. I'm not going to live with, she says, let's live together as husband. And he says, no, you didn't like what I did before. So, I'm not going to give you what you want. I'm going to reject the bed.
Right. And Barbara Green describes Michal's decision not to participate in the chaos of adding to David's household as healthful.
Okay, thank you. Wonderful paper.
Thank you. I am getting lost in some of the comments, so let's see.
Can I help you?
Certainly. Let's see.
Yeah, Suzanne Schultz had a comment. Would you please explain what the ramifications are for contemporary feminist, womanist, queer, gendered studies ramifications of your literary focus on Michal?
Well, wow, that's a wide question. Feminist implications for Michal? I guess it's always helpful to read with another character. I very much appreciate reading against the text for other perspectives, which of course is definitely one of the goals of feminist reading, reading critiquing the power plays. Womanist, queer, and gender studies. So there is a section that I skipped over a little bit. I did not deal as closely with the passage about the maidservants here in this presentation as I have done elsewhere. Michal's, in her retort to David, in her sarcasm, she refers to the maidservants and revealing himself before them. And it's really very much, Michal is in more of a privileged position of power. However trapped she may be, she's still in a more privileged position than the maidservants that she brings sneeringly into the discourse in the exchange back and forth. It is worthwhile definitely to also consider their perspective as well. David's response there is kind of, well, they're admiring me, but how much of it is actually, is that all in his mind or not? And really women who are in an even less powerful situation, who are the most vulnerable as the servants and the servants of the maidservants, as it says here, really are probably less likely to be pleased with David, as they are probably more likely to be abused with the situation. So I think in that case there, Michal is not portrayed in the best possible light as she brings the servants of the maidservants into the picture. And it is a case really of patriarchal traps turn women against each other, and often those in more powerful situations have thrown others under the bus. So
all right, our next question is from Victor. How are we to read into Michal's punishment about having no children for the rest of her life? What does that mean?
Well, it can mean lots of things. Some people, as we were speaking earlier, viewed that as a punishment of Michal, and J. Cheryl Exum talks about that as part of her literary murder, as I noted, and it's really part of, it's another way to silence her, basically.
All right, our next question is from Sherry Brown. Thanks for a great paper, she writes. What do you make of how Michal continues to be identified as the daughter of Saul, even though she is now the wife of David, and really doesn't need to be qualified at this point? Is this continual distancing between David and Michal, or something else?
Yes, actually, I think when she's in the presence of David here, she's called the daughter of Saul, and elsewhere when she's with Saul, she's identified as the wife of David. So I think it just highlights the contrariness. It's a subtle kind of dig that she doesn't really fit any place. She's being othered by both houses. It's a simplistic response. It's harder without a dialogue. You just respond to a question if you want to know more.
Yes, please, people, if you would like to join us in the Zoom window, use the raised hand feature and we'll move you in. If not, I'll continue to read the questions here from the chat. Oh, we see someone popping in. Looks like Brant has a question. We'll jump to him.
Great.
Okay, am I here?
Yes. Hi,
Hey,
Brent.
okay, great. Oh, thanks so much for a fascinating paper. I wrote out my question there on the side. I just, as a Gospels person, I'd never noticed this before until your paper, that when it shifts to Michal's vantage point, one of the ways it does that is by saying that she despised him in her heart, right?
Mhm.
And that just made me think of the two references in Luke's infancy narrative, where the exact same terminology is used to give you the vantage point of Mary. It's intake cardia out to. So I don't know what to make of that parallel, but I just wanted to thank you. I'd never thought of it before. Any thoughts on the similarity? I can't help but wonder here if Luke is, he's so Septuagintal, right, in the way his language is formed. I just can't help but wonder if this was anywhere in the back of his mind in the way he describes that twice, right, to give Mary's vantage point in her heart. So it's not just through her eyes, but there's a kind of interiority to the vantage point. So any thoughts on that? Wonderful paper.
Oh, I haven't thought about it in connection to Mary. That is interesting and certainly fun to ponder. But it is pretty rare in the Hebrew Bible that we get any kind of sense of the interiority of what a character is experiencing. So that's another way that we could identify with her through that glimpse, just as we are invited to probably identify with Mary and ponder the circumstances like in Luke 2 that she observes in her heart. So
Thank you so much. Great paper. Really appreciate it.
thank you. I hadn't thought about Mary. That's kind of fun to ponder.
I wonder what Sirach 42:11 tells us about women in windows. I don't know if that was supposed to be widows. Is it threatening to Ben Sira that a daughter sees through the lattice, that she hides herself while gazing? Is the lattice different from a window in that sight sound passes, but one cannot crawl through like David?
Okay. Yes, there's Sirach Sirach does have women at the window instead, or into also, let me see. The daughter sees through the lattice. That's interesting. I don't have 42:11 in front of me. Todd, do you want to hop into the scene here?
There it is.
Oh, yeah, let me turn my audio and video on. Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe the broader question is, it looks like maybe there's some help in the chat too from Joachim. I mean, the broader question is, how should I picture a window, right? I mean, it doesn't have storm windows, it doesn't have glass. Is it something that one hides oneself in? Is it something that, I mean, you focused on the vista aspect of a window, whereas for Ben Sira, at least, it's a threatening thing. If a woman has access to seeing or being seen, but maybe not passing. I mean, I'm not sure what to make of the difference, if there's a difference between lattice and window here. Maybe Joachim said something helpful. So I don't know. I mean, you said some very enlightening things about how windows function. And I guess I just wonder if, like many other people in the audience, if I'm, thinking of all these other parts of the Bible that you make me think of, and if you've thought of them yourself, then I want to hear what you think. And if you haven't, then it might be worth looking at in the future.
There are multiple words for the window, and you really see the parallelism in the Judges 5 because it chooses two different words, as you're noticing the lattice there as well. I am wondering too with you if the lattice is more covered and less visible. I'm also drawn to the artifacts then in my response to you, which isn't a direct answer or response to your question at all, but it's reminding me that well, these are Phoenician artifacts, and part of the way they identify as Phoenician is instead of Egyptian is because the windows are not partially covered, and that you see the whole frame there is part of that. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that's what I remember as far as windows and what I've come across.
Thanks.
Unfortunately, I'm noticing that it's 3:29. Would you like one more question or would you like to end there?
Oh, there's so many. I want to read people's questions.
And I'm happy to send this chat to you after if you'd like to continue to have dialogue with the participants.
Thank you.
I'm in the unfortunate position of being commissioned to make sure this session ends at 12:30. In anticipation of the general meeting, which I'm also commissioned here to invite you all to please attend. We have quite a few items for voting, and also to urge you to complete the Survey Monkey for the voting that's going to go on at the meeting on particular rosters of candidates for appointment. We really do need everyone to come so that we have a quorum. And I also want to give people a chance to do that survey and also to take a break before we meet at 4 o'clock or 1 o'clock my time. So if Josh, if you can give Sarah a copy of those questions, I'm sure that'd be extremely helpful. And Sarah, once again, I want to join all others who have attended this session, and thank you for a really fine paper. Thanks very, very much.